Israel's strikes in Gaza go beyond what is necessary to fight Hamas. Humanitarian aid cannot be weaponized. It has to be in accordance with the humanitarian principles, and therefore we have the humanitarian aid organizations that are able to provide that aid.
The EU's top diplomat becomes the latest politician to criticise the Israeli government for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. We will discuss that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we're going to first of all talk about the delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, there is a new setup for doing that, where it is being funneled through private companies. This follows an 11-week blockade on the delivery of any humanitarian aid to Gaza by the Israeli government, and that's proving to be quite controversial. And second of all, there was a video popped up and was widely shared on social media on Tuesday, which showed hundreds and hundreds of people in Gaza descending on one of the few points at which this aid is being delivered, and quite a few people were injured when there was some gunfire there. So there's quite a few things that we need to understand about what's going on. And also some more European politicians, including some very high profile ones, have started to criticise the Israeli government for how they are contributing to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So there is plenty for us to talk about with the BBC's chief international correspondent, Lyse Doucet, who is here. Hello, Lyse.
Good to be with you again, Adam.
Lyse, just explain to me what this new structure for delivering aid in Gaza actually is.
The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was recently created. It's said to be the product of Israeli and American ideas, but we understand the Israelis put forward the blueprint because the gap between the Israeli government and the UN agencies has collapsed long ago. So the Israeli government, under huge pressure, including from the Americans, about feeding Gaza, about not preventing Gazans from getting critical aid, set this up. It's backed up by a private security company, which is run by a former CIA officer. And they work with a very small organization in Gaza. I was reading a story about it today called Three Brothers. There was a very interesting article in the Financial Times about it, that so many Palestinian businessmen, organizations were approached to work with this, and they all repeated saying we cannot work with this because this is, as the criticism goes, this is weaponizing aid. This does not follow humanitarian principles of an equal and just distribution of aid. But there was only this one group called Three Brothers that people seem to know very little about. They seem to have a gasoline company or something. They have agreed to staff these hubs. They have set up, we understand so far, and we're continuing to get new information, 4 hubs. But the critical point, Adam, is that it is only 4, whereas the usual distribution networks of the United Nations, working with local communities, have hundreds of distribution centers, have trusted contacts, although the Israelis continue to accuse Hamas of stealing aid. The UN still says that that is not the major issue. The major issue is that criminal gangs exploit the shortages. And the last critical point is that they are only in the south and the center. And this has fueled criticism that really one of the main reasons, the 2 main reasons, is to provide some food to Gazans, but only enough to prevent them from starving. And that has been said by right-wing members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. And secondly, to force Gazans to move down to the south so that Israel says it wants to concentrate on its objective to, in its words, to defeat Hamas. But it's believed that the right-wing government in Israel wants to push people to the south to start fulfilling their objectives, to find another home for Palestinians, and to implement what President Trump calls a freedom zone. In other words, to completely depopulate Gaza and rebuild it and allow many others to live there. The legal opinion on that is that it is ethnic cleansing, forced displacement.
And so the objections to this way of delivering aid, it's not just a kind of ideological thing that, oh, the private sector is bad and delivering it via the UN would be good. There are practical objections too, and I suppose we can see some of the implications of that in the crowds of people who are like all hoarding around the few distribution points that there are.
Yes, and there's humanitarian leaders in the United States who I've known for a very long time who were approached to lead this organization. They declined. Just days ago, the man who did take on the job resigned, saying, I cannot lead an organization that does not respect humanitarian principles of an independent and just distribution of aid. It's being carried out under the gun. And the first distribution of aid, it was overwhelmed by desperate Gazans. And while the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation says that its guards did not fire, we understand that IDF soldiers outside the secure distribution sites did open fire, and the UN says nearly 50 people were injured. Now, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is saying we are still distributing, but many are saying that how can you possibly feed 2.1 million people? And also, the UN is doing a little bit of aid, but they're only allowed to bring in flour. They can't bring in fresh water. They can't bring in fresh vegetables and fruit. They can't bring in fuel. It really is just doing the absolute minimum. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called it a teaspoon.
And then we talk about the geopolitics of this. Let's listen to Kaja Kallas, who is the EU's top diplomat and Vice President of the European Commission. Let's listen to a little bit of what she was saying today.
Israel's strikes in Gaza go beyond what is necessary to fight Hamas. Humanitarian aid cannot be weaponized. It has to be in accordance with the humanitarian principles, and therefore we have the humanitarian aid organizations that are able to provide that aid.
So that was Kaja Kallas speaking in Brussels on Wednesday. Lyse, that phrase, Israeli strikes in Gaza go beyond what is necessary to fight Hamas. Why is it so significant that she is saying that?
And she's not the only one who's saying it. The German Chancellor, which is in some ways more significant because of a very close relationship between Germany and Israel, Friedrich Merz says, I don't understand the logic. I don't know what this war is about. She says it has gone beyond what is necessary in Gaza. We had that extraordinary statement by Canada, France, and Britain, which was criticized by the Israeli government. They also said this goes beyond what is necessary. Every country which criticize emphasize that they understand Israel's right to defend itself after the horrific attacks of October the 7th. But today it is 600 days, and a really crucial point, many more in Israel are saying enough is enough. There is no logic anymore to this war. Israel keeps saying, the government, Prime Minister Netanyahu keeps saying this, we have to defeat Hamas and bring the hostages home. The families of the hostages who have been released themselves say, there was a statement the other day by one who was released who said when she was in captivity, what she feared the most was Israeli strikes. The most hostages have been brought home through negotiations. And so many are saying, we understand your need to defend yourself. We understand you worry about the threat from Hamas, but Hamas has been all but destroyed. And many say there should be other ways to do this rather than Gaza is in utter ruin as it is now. It is unlivable. And you're getting accusations from doctors about the strikes on hospitals, on schools, on shelters, and the starvation of an entire people. Even Ehud Olmert, he's been everywhere, including on the BBC. Last week he said it's close to a war crime.
Israeli Prime Minister.
Yes, close to a war crime. And then yesterday he said it is a war crime to starve a population.
But is there any evidence that this kind of growing chorus on the world stage of condemnation for Israel is having any impact on Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, the setting up of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation comes as in the midst of this criticism. And
because previously there was an 11-week blockade where no aid
was going in. And Prime Minister Netanyahu and his supporters kept saying there is no starvation. There is a lot of aid in Gaza, and it is being stolen by Hamas. And as I mentioned, it's not perfect. It's a destroyed population. People are desperate, but the UN continues to say they don't have evidence that there is systematic stealing by Hamas. It is the criminal gangs who exploit the shortages, and people who just will die for a piece of bread. They are so living in such dire circumstances. But when Prime Minister Netanyahu recently responded to the statement by Britain, France, and Canada, he basically said, I am with President Trump. I am backing his plan to make this a freedom zone. Until President Trump picks up the phone and says, Prime Minister Netanyahu, stop it, it's not going to stop. We do know that when I was in the Persian Gulf area, when President Trump was doing his tour of three Gulf states, he started speaking about Gaza and about starvation and bringing the hostages home, and so that put more impetus into the food, getting people. He himself says we had sharper words from Marco Rubio, sharper words from President Trump, so that galvanized the Israelis to come up with this plan to bypass completely the United Nations system. And that is what Kaja Kallas is saying. We have a system already. We can feed them. They are said to have 140,000 pallets of food and other essential items just waiting outside to distribute it. And it's not being allowed to come in and to be distributed. So will the pressure from within Israeli society have an impact? Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to ignore it. It is President Trump he's the one that Prime Minister Netanyahu would listen to.
And Netanyahu was speaking in the Israeli parliament on Wednesday, and he seemed to confirm that Mohammed Sinwar, the Hamas leader, had been killed in an Israeli airstrike a couple of weeks ago. And that seems to be kind of the first confirmation at an official level we've got of that.
Yes, they hit a major hospital in Gaza, and at the time they said that Mohammed Sinwar, who's the brother of Yahya Sinwar, who was Israel killed the year before, the mastermind of the October 7th attacks, his brother Mohammed was believed to be as hardline, if not even more hardline, with more significant military experience than his brother Yahya. And Israel at the time had said, we can't confirm whether we got him. He was said to be having meetings underground. I think the figure was 28 people were killed in the hospital. Others were injured. It was widely criticized because in international law, they do say that hospitals are sites that should not be attacked. They are civilian infrastructure. But there is some, I'm not going to get to it because it is a legal opinion, but if they are used for military purposes, that changes it. But you still have to be cognizant of the collateral, a terrible, terrible word. And the criticism is that Israel,
in other words, the civilians. And there doesn't seem, the critics would say, and more legal voices, 800 jurists sent a letter to the British government at the start of this week saying you have to do something. What is happening in Gaza is illegal. These are possible war crimes, and you have to do something about it. And today there was more than 300 authors, writers also said that what is happening in Gaza is genocide. So, Adam, the voices are getting louder and louder, and more people in society are saying, not just in Britain, but in many countries across the world, are saying enough is enough, that this goes beyond what can be accepted in a civilized world. Well, Lyse, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
And now, as billed, let's catch up with Alex Forsyth, who's been a very busy political correspondent, even though in theory, because Parliament's on its half-term holidays, politics shouldn't be busy. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Adam.
Did you enjoy our time in the tent together at the Literary Festival?
I certainly did. What a tent it was.
Should we do all newscasts in yurts from now on?
As long as it's sunny-ish.
Yes, exactly. And in beautiful scenery.
Yeah, that always helps.
Not in one of your car parks. Anyway, right. Lots of things to catch up on. On Wednesday, we woke up to a very interesting interview from Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, talking about a column he'd written in the Times newspaper with 5 other police chiefs about the spending review. What's your take on what he was saying?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. So we are now 2 weeks or so out from the spending and review, which is the point at which the government's going to set out the departmental spending limits for all government departments for the next few years. And at this point in the process, when you have big moments like this, where the government's talking about where and what it's going to spend on whatever, you always do get a bit of pre-lobbying. So, there are people kind of coming out and making the case as to why the area that they work in should be adequately funded. So I think that's just the important context. But having said all of that, this was still a really interesting piece because, as you say, it came from Mark Rowley and these other senior police figures, and they'd written publicly, so this was a sort of public form of lobbying government, if you like, in the Times. And they were effectively saying, look, if you don't adequately invest in policing at the spending review, then we, as the operational police guys, cannot deliver what you've said that you want to do as a government. So the government set out some really clear priorities for policing, things like halving knife crime, halving violence against women and girls, and getting more neighbourhood police out there. And they were saying, look, if we don't get the cash, however noble the ambitions might be, it's just going to be really difficult to deliver on them.
And here is Sir Mark Rowley talking to the Today programme on Wednesday morning.
This government has made 3 big pledges that policing will have to contribute massively to. One about strengthening neighbourhood policing so that we can be better at fighting crime in communities and protecting people from antisocial behaviour. Secondly, they want to halve violence against women and girls in a decade. It's a crime that's at epidemic levels and growing every year. And thirdly, they want to halve knife crime. We think that's balanced and sensible ambition, but it is very, very ambitious. We're carrying the scar tissue of years of austerity cuts and the effects of that. We're not just asking for more money. We want radical reform in policing as well.
And we've discussed this before, Alex. It's called shroud waving, where people who are at risk of losing some money or not getting as much money as they would like in terms of public spending then say, here are all the dreadful things that will happen if you don't give us this money that we need. And actually, this was a slightly more sophisticated version of that, because it was saying to Starmer and Rachel Reeves, here are the big priorities and deliverables that you want to achieve that are at risk. It's not like, oh, here's how many things will go uninvestigated or criminals will go on the run if you don't fund us properly. And they also made the case directly aimed at the Treasury of, oh, research shows every £1 you spend on policing creates £4 of, guess what, economic growth.
Yeah, which is another quite familiar argument from people who are trying to petition the Treasury for more funds is, there's a long-term benefit to you from us if you give us more funds. I mean, this is all quite familiar territory, but I think you're right in making the observation that the fact that this group of senior police figures very deliberately chose the government's own priorities to say that we won't be able to do these unless you give us the funding you need. I guess the bigger question that sits behind that is, will it make any difference to Rachel Reeves' thinking? Because this will not be the only group or sector that is doing this kind of thing, either publicly or behind the scenes at this point in the spending review process. We already know that Secretaries of State, for example, are having conversations with the Treasury team who are working out this spending review and lobbying for their departments. And then on top of that, you will have, like in this case, police figures, in other cases from perhaps local government or from voluntary sectors, doing quite similar things, making submissions or arguing their case as to why their sector should be adequately funded. So how much it makes a difference or not, who knows? Because we know what Rachel Reeves has indicated and where the government is at, is that when they are setting day-to-day spending budgets for all the departments, then things are looking pretty tight.
And also there was a little interesting subplot in this article that they wrote as well, related to a story we did in quite a lot of depth last week, which was the review into sentencing policy in England by David Gauke, the former Justice Secretary, who recommended lots of things, including maybe not sending people to prison for sentences of less than 12 months and kind of monitoring them in the community, and letting people out of prison at an earlier point in their sentence if they'd behaved properly while they were behind bars. The police chief saying there could be knock-on consequences for the police of all of that.
Yeah, and Mark Rowley actually said this morning that he didn't think there'd been an impact assessment of the impact on policing of those sentencing reforms. And as well as what the police chiefs were saying in direct result to the spending review about those sentencing reforms, there was another story in the Times, which was a letter that was sent to the Ministry of Justice before those sentencing reforms were announced, warning about the possible impact on safety if people were released early, or if there was this sort of greater focus on people being out in the community rather than in prison. Now, it's worth saying in response to all of this, about policing, the government is pointing to the extra funding that it's put into policing already, and it set itself targets to get more police out on the streets and more neighbourhood policing, and they are pointing to those and saying, look, we are back the police, we're going to back the police, that's what we do. And on the other stuff around sentencing reforms, they say that this letter was sent before Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, stood up and said what they were going to do about sentencing, and they say they took into account some of the concerns that had been raised about possible impact on public safety, which is why they announced things like more money for the probation service. Now, that debate hasn't gone away, but it's just worth reflecting what the government's been saying about it. There are still lots of people across the justice sort of sector more broadly who are waiting to see how all of this plays out, because we know, of course, that the justice system is under strain. The prison capacity is really limited, and that's why the government is taking some of these steps. So I think it's still a very active discussion, but interesting that you had these sort of two things coming at once towards the government.
And on the other side of this ledger, the idea of reform of the police, I thought it was interesting when Mark Rowley was on the Today programme talking about this, saying, the actual shape of England's police forces and how they work hasn't really changed since the 60s. I wonder if you've got 6 senior English coppers making this point that there's some big reforms possible here, maybe we could see something quite dramatic in terms of the structure of the police.
Yeah, because that's what they're arguing for, basically. They're talking about radical reform. And if you look at the names on the list, there's some of the big forces. So it's West Midlands Police, it's Merseyside Police, it's Greater Manchester Police, it is, of course, Metropolitan Police, who are all the joint signatories to this letter. And they are when they talk about reform, so it is about the structure of the policing, but they're talking about these more efficient police forces and then this overarching body, some sort of national police agency to oversee it all. I guess the sort of thing is,
Well, you know what? I would just gently point out, and it was good of you to list the geographical areas there. They all sound like police forces that would be quite happy to absorb smaller police forces.
Exactly, they're the big beasts of the police world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, completely. And I think
for a merger.
The other thing about this, of course, is that, if you are simultaneously making the case that we might struggle to deliver on what the government sets as its sort of operational policing ambitions or priorities because of a lack of funding, do you then have the funding to go on and undertake a significant programme of reform, which, as we know, can be costly and can sometimes be slow, but nonetheless it's really worth noting that they're lobbying for that alongside.
And also, now just trying to find what's the actual phrase that they use when they just talk about the new pressures that the police are facing. They say, we're confronting growing social volatility, such as last summer's disorder. So reference to the disorder that followed the Southport murders. I thought that was quite interesting as well, that they're clearly signalling that we're kind of in a new phase as a society here.
Yeah, and they also reference the crime threats emboldened by the online world, escalating global insecurity. And I think that's right. They're sort of using that in the context of this letter to say, you might have given us a bit more money, which is what the government's pointed to, but things are moving so fast in the policing world and we're still operating, under the systems and the structures that we had before. And all of this needs a really good look at if we're going to keep pace with the way that things are changing so rapidly.
Now, you talked about the word structures there. That leads me nicely on to houses. And
well done. Come on. I don't know. That was okay. I'll give you a 5 out of 10.
A terrible party game. Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister and Communities and Local Government Minister, out trying to get more people to build more houses, which seems to be what she spends about 75% of her time doing these days.
This is such a central thing to the government's whole agenda. They were talking about it before the election. They've talked about it a lot since the election because they've set themselves this overall target of getting 1.5 million homes, new homes, built over the course of the Parliament. And I think anybody you speak to across the sector says that is a really stretching target. Really stretching target. So she was talking about another sort of stage in the changes that they're making around the planning process, because the government has pointed the finger quite heavily at the planning system for some of the delays in getting homes built. So they've made loads of changes already. And the latest is that they're looking at how to encourage smaller house builders to get homes built. And one of the things is for perhaps smaller plots. So, not loads and loads of homes, but, a limited number of homes. They might loosen or change or simplify some of the regulations about biodiversity to make it easier, they say, for developers, smaller developers, to build smaller developments. Now, there has been a bit of pushback from this from wildlife groups who say you shouldn't do anything that's going to water down that kind of environmental protection. But Angela Rayner was asked about this today, and she said, we're not doing that. It's not either or. We're just trying to simplify the process. But I think it's sort of another example of the government's making this argument that it's trying to move away the blockers, as it likes to call them, to get these homes built. But when they do make these changes or propose these changes to the planning system, then they tend to run into some form of opposition, which is quite interesting in and of itself.
And also just this other technical tweak to the process that we've seen. Well, I suppose not technical, it's actually a bit more than that they've applied in other places of the planning system, of getting council officials to decide planning applications rather than the planning committees of councils, which are made up of councillors who might have a bit more like political skin in the game that might make them want to turn down a development.
Yeah.
So kind of taking away some powers from elected councillors and giving it to unelected council officials in the hope that they might say yes more often.
Yeah, and they're talking again about limiting that to smaller scale developments, not huge, great big ones. As someone who has sat through a lot of planning committees in my life. So the way it works, in case anyone hasn't encountered one, is you submit a planning application, and if it goes towards this committee of councillors, you know, they will sit around in a big room and they'll have a big long list of all of the decisions that they need to make about all the different planning applications in a given day. I mean, I once sat through a planning committee that lasted something like 7 hours. So they can be quite lengthy processes. And like you say, I think the government's thinking is sometimes that can be influenced by the views of local communities lobbying their elected officials to, you know, councillors to make one decision or another. The pushback from that, from the Conservatives, for example, is them saying that this is sort of anti-democratic, that actually councillors, the elected representatives of any given area, should have a say on behalf of the people they represent about what gets built in any certain place. So again, I mean, a lot of people say it's really good the government is trying to grip this and speed up planning and change the planning system, because there are lots of hurdles and blocks in the way that it currently works. But I think also some of the things that they are then attempting to do are running up against pockets of opposition all the way. And I think it's going to, I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think it's really going to come down to a test of the government's resolve on this and whether it's prepared to press on, because it's so determined to get these homes built, even if that means in some places there are individuals or groups or communities that aren't entirely happy with it.
And Alex, as we were talking, the Welsh First Minister, Ellen Morgan, has been speaking at an Eisteddfod.
Ooh.
And she has called on the government to abolish the two-child benefit cap.
Oh, it's a theme of the week.
Yeah, another big Labour figure saying, got to change your position to deal with child poverty.
That is interesting, because we know the government's under pressure about this. There's a very active discussion in the Labour Party at the moment about broader welfare, as we know, about the government's welfare reforms, but also specifically this issue where the current system limits some means-tested benefits to 2 children only. And ministers are looking at this, and Bridget Phillipson, who is the Education Secretary but also co-chairs the government's Child Poverty Task Force, and they're going to come out with a report, a strategy about tackling child poverty in the autumn, a little bit delayed, but in the autumn. And she has indicated that removing that cap on some means-tested benefits for children is on the table, but the government haven't made a decision on this yet. And in the meantime, you're getting a lot of people in the Labour Party saying, we think you should do it. So it seems like Ellen Morgan is the latest person to do that.
No, we didn't have a chance yesterday to catch up on Nigel Farage's speech and news conference, where the leader of Reform UK laid out some new policies.
Well, he called for the 2-child benefit cap to be lifted.
Yes, he joined that argument. Oh, that was a link I could have done seamlessly.
I know,
and I didn't do. Thank you,
you
though.
did a structural segue, but
you
not
saved me. Yeah, not the actual good one. Yeah, so you were there in the audience. What was it like?
Well, I mean, Nigel Farage isn't one to miss a political opportunity. And I think, you know, he picked the week when politicians are away from Westminster, because Westminster is in recess. And, you know,
because of course he was away when the EU reset deal was done.
He was away the week before, and now the rest of Westminster is away, and Nigel Farage is back. And
literal
so
cat and mouse.
He gave this press conference. And I mean, look, I think he knows that this is one of those weeks in recess where kind of the normal tsunami of political news slows a bit, and you get a lot of journalists in Westminster looking around for news lines and stories. So what does Nigel Farage do? He gives a big speech, and you know it was a big speech. It was there was a lot in it, and there was a fair amount of sort of different policies that he talked about in this speech. But I think what you can take away from it was this was him trying to give a sense of what he thinks reform would do if it were to ever get into government. But it's worth noting that what I took away from that is interesting about where he's sort of positioning his party on the political spectrum. So, for example, calling for that 2-child benefit cap to be scrapped. A lot of people would say that he's now positioning himself, aiming his party at sort of left-wing voters, Labour voters, veering into their territory, because, of course, he knows this is a bit of a point of contention within the Labour Party at the moment. But the other thing about it is that he was listing a lot of policies that would be really quite costly. So, yes, lifting that benefit cap, but also reversing the winter fuel payment cuts in full. Also reiterating a policy that was in the reform platform at the general election, which is raising the point at which you start paying income tax to £20,000. Now, if you add up all the sums for all of those, that runs into the billions and billions. And he was pointing to some of the places he thought the party could identify some money. So scrapping net zero, scrapping diversity policies, cutting down on waste and quangos. But, you know, people like the Institute for Fiscal Studies have already come out and said, about these sums, you know, do they really add up when you're talking about all of the tax changes and the like that Nigel Farage wants to make? And I think, you know, his argument, because I put this to Nigel Farage at the press conference, and he was sort of saying, look, I'm giving you a flavour of what we would do if we were to get into government.
Oh, you can argue about numbers adding up. You could probably argue that at no point in the history of any form of government has anybody ever thought that numbers added up. What I've tried to do today is to give you an idea of direction of policy, of priorities, of what we think is important, of what we think it's going to cost, and how we think we're going to pay for it.
No party at this point has like a fully costed manifesto. I'm giving you a sense of our priorities and a sense of where we'd look to pay for some of it. But I think the thing is for Nigel Farage is if you're going to talk yourself up as a potential party of government, you've got to come up with a policy platform that is really credible and costed and affordable. And, you know, I think they are going to have to do that.
And he semi-accepted Keir Starmer's invitation to have a debate, except he upped the ante and said it shouldn't be a debate, it should be a town hall meeting taking questions from voters in a working men's club in the north of England.
With Channel 4 racing on in the background.
So it'll have to be at lunchtime.
Although I'm not even sure if Channel 4 is like I saw some stuff on social media saying Channel 4 racing isn't even on anymore. But anyway, who knows? I don't
They have to go back in the past as well.
Maybe. Yeah. Who knows? But yes, he did, because that's another bit of the politics of this. Is, you know, he was trying to say. Well, he did say, he wasn't trying to say, he did say, in his view, the Conservatives are irrelevant and therefore Reform UK is now pitching itself as the sort of official opposition to Labour. And that was the framing of his whole argument. He was saying that Reform UK is now the party of the working people. Of course, I think the Conservatives would have something to say about that. And, you know, I think there is also a sort of another challenge for Nigel Farage in that when he's coming up with this sort of policy platform that he's starting to tease out now, and he's talking about things like lifting the 2-child benefit cap, that is veering towards the more left wing of politics, if you want to put it through that sort of traditional framing. But is that going to be popular with all of his other supporters? You know, the challenge for so many parties, and I think for Reform in particular, is they're saying we can take voters from Labour and the Conservatives. Some people might think, fair enough, the old left-right political lines are blurred. But I think there is always a challenge with trying to sort of hang together a broad electoral base, and that trying to appeal to some voters, you don't end up alienating others.
Alex, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
And just an update on the story we covered on the previous episode of Newscast, the collision that hospitalised more than 50 people in Liverpool after the Liverpool FC victory parade. Merseyside police have been given further time to question the 53-year-old suspect that they arrested on suspicion of attempted murder, dangerous driving and driving under the influence of drugs. So he is still being questioned. And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Thanks very much for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.